uh, avid community advocate. You hear me often. I call myself a community queen. And so I'm here to help moderate a conversation amongst communities, families, experts, people of personal experience, people with some legislative experience, just about all of us, right? Who have experienced and have watched and observed the devastation of the crack era, the war on drugs, the war on the Black community happened in our 80s, 90s, 2000s. That devastation that we are still healing from. So, although this landmark decision for Blake is great, it's an acknowledgement for our state Supreme Court to do something better and to reverse those ills. But the Blake actually does not reverse all the harm and hurt that already occurred. And that's up to us to do. So I find myself in the community trying to do that as best I can by making good policy and from changing the bad policy that was created and created such trauma in our community. So we're here as a community, and we pretty much can agree on that. Folks who are working towards racial equity, people who are working to dismantle racism in our systems and in our structures, we can agree to that. But the strategies and the response to the Blake decision, we may not all agree on the same strategy. So we're here just to have a dialogue, to bring awareness to the community so that we know what's going on, and to also really get us prepared with this landmark decision to help us move forward in our organizing so that we can never go back, that we refuse to ever go back to the time of that devastation in the Black community, and that we will not go forward to continue to create and continue that harm. So without further ado, I would like to start our panel discussion and dialogue, and I would like to start with Isaac Joy, the president of King County Equity Now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amija. Thank you, Trey, for the introductions, and thank you everyone that's here joining us today. I would like to contextualize this conversation in the history of anti-Black racism in the U.S. And so at King County Equity Now, we are grounded in the theory of racial realism. Racial realism dispels of the myth that the Black community is on a slow, incremental path towards equity, towards justice, that this generation of Blacks in America will fare better than the last, and so on until Black little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character, as the Reverend MLK would say. Instead, racial realism says, and we understand, that America's legal, political, and economic structures result in a permanent racial subcaste system, that the same inequalities our Black communities face today will replicate over and over, perpetually, with no relief or respite in sight. Here at King County Equity Now, we understand that 400 years after being violently forced to the USA in bondage, over 150 years after the official abolishment of slavery in the United States, 70 years past the start of the Civil Rights era, over 65 and 55 years past Brown versus Board and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, respectively, that the typical Black American family has nearly $0 in wealth, is on a path to see zero wealth by 2050. That Black people are gunned down or choked or beaten in seemingly weekly national recordings with no legal or political redress. That Black people face heinous distortions in every facet of our society, whether that be health, education, finance, public safety, commercial business, entrepreneurship. That Black people face immeasurable violence daily by America's legal system, which has taken hundreds of thousands of cumulative years of Black lives without ever giving a second thought. That the Confederate flag breached our nation's White House by white extremists for the first time in 2021. That same group drove our past president to power and is in higher numbers now than in decades past. Or that the Georgia legislators currently and the South are enacting anti-Black voter suppression laws not seen since Jim Crow era. Now, here at King County Equity Now, we understand that anti-Black racism is the largest governing ideology of this country. To put differently, if the US were a garden, anti-Black racism is by far the most pervasive, dominant weed, strangling and choking out any plantings of trust, love, accountability, fairness, truth, good, peace, or any sustained progressive policy. We understand that America's, as we said, legal, political, and economic structures result in a permanent racial subcaste system, and that the same inequalities our Black communities face today will replicate over and over perpetually with no relief or respite in sight. That is, of course, unless we disrupt racial realism. Today marks an opportunity for our communities to engage to disrupt racial realism by rising to meet the Blake decision with legislation that honors the harm done to communities by the state, restores the harm, and moves forward with an intent to never inflict such violence on our Black and brown communities or any communities. Anything short of that will be perpetuating racial realism cycle. And the legislators that choose to put forward legislation need to take accountability for that action. Thank you.
Thank you for grounding us, Isaac. That's wonderful, because that is the center of this conversation. Although I shared earlier around the crack era and the war on drugs that the systemic issues and the systemic racism that's at play goes back beyond the years. As people have said in the past, I've shared that the Black Lives Matters movement began when people were being captured and kidnapped off the continent and fighting for their liberty and for their freedom from the beginning. That's the Black Lives Matters movement. And so what we're doing here is moving that through our efforts on every level, including policy. And so earlier today at 10 o'clock, there was a hearing from a legislative bill in the Senate, 5476, somebody can correct me, that is trying to bring about some policy to respond to the Blake decision. And so what I would like to do is turn this over to one of our speakers today, Malika Lamont, the director of Vocal. And you can share more about who you are, Malika. If you want to share a little bit about what's happening on the legislative level regarding some of the policy responses to the Blake decision.
Thank you, Amijah. My name is Malika Lamont, and as Amijah said, I'm the director of Vocal Washington, which stands for Voices of Community Activists and Leaders Washington. We are a group that works to build political power with people that have been marginalized by mass incarceration, the war on drugs, other forms of systemic violence, including racism and abusive responses to behavioral health issues, including substance use disorder and mental health issues, homelessness, HIV and AIDS, many of the issues that have disproportionately impacted Black and brown people. We have been a part of working on legislation we were attempting to decriminalize drugs with House Bill 1499 and build a pathway forward for our state to build a relevant response for communities to be able to implement according to what their communities need. We had a framework that we worked out, and we were working with a number of legislators. And then Blake decision came down. Our bill, what stopped it was the decriminalization piece. It had bipartisan support for the system build out across the state. And then with the Blake decision, the decriminalization piece was taken over. We didn't have to worry about that piece, but we weren't able to, what we've been trying to do is resurrect the statewide response piece of it and get that included into the framework of 5476 and any other responses that would listen to us. I'm part of the Care First Coalition, and we work in collaboration with Treatment First Washington to be the Pathways to Recovery Coalition. And my family has been impacted by the war on drugs. I do not live in Seattle. I was born there, but I have not lived most of my life there. I've lived in Eastern Washington, in Puyallup, and I live in Thurston County. However, my family members do live in Seattle. My younger brothers and other members of my family, and my older sister is from Seattle as well. The war on drugs definitely impacted all of us, but definitely them more directly than me because I was in another part of the state. And but it has impacted me since being an adult with many of the relationships that I've had. And in high school, I graduated from Foss High School, which is where children from Hilltop often ended up. And many people that in the 90s knew about in the late 80s gang violence and the disproportionate and violent response to our communities because of the crack epidemic. I witnessed that. And also, I was reading. Am I supposed to respond to the questions in the chat, or is that supposed, or am I?
No, you don't need to respond to the questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So we have been working to try and create a statewide response because what we're seeing is that as soon as the Blake decision came down, Mullet and Hobbs have proposed multiple bills that would insert knowingly back into the statute, therefore making it constitutional. What the Supreme Court decided was that because knowingly possessing drugs was not in this statute, that is what made it unconstitutional. It did not guarantee that the simple possession statute would not come back into play. It just said that the way that it was originally written was unconstitutional. Along with everybody else, I was very excited and happy when the Supreme Court decision came down, but just as swiftly as we were happy, we saw the system reorienting to protect itself. And even though, and I know we're having a conversation about 5476, and we don't think that it is perfect. We don't think that it's definitely not. Youth should not be criminalized for a health condition. That there should, the Class C felony is not ideal. Police are not the place where people with behavioral health issues need to be interacting with. But we know because of the racist nature of our overall system, that is what oftentimes happens. And the drug war was designed to intentionally harm Black and brown people. And many of our policies before that, as has already been, covered by the history that Isaac shared with us at the beginning. 5476, the thing that it does do is create a uniform response across the state. We are already seeing local municipalities rising up with in Marysville, in Lewis County, and in other places across the state. And oftentimes my community members and I, and I'm sure many others, Imagine and I spoke about this, it feels like you need a green book to be able to navigate the state of Washington under the best of circumstances. However, if we end up with a patchwork of laws, it will be even worse because we will always, under the current framework, be disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. And if you get pulled over and maybe you don't use drugs, but somebody that does, and they left something in your car, or, we know that it's not unforetold that things get planted in individuals' cars. And then these laws are used to criminalize people. Part of what 5476 does is maintain the decriminalization for personal use piece that the Blake decision started. Like I said, is not ideal, but we're going to have a patchwork of laws, and we will end up in a much more insecure place as Black and brown people in this state if something isn't done that isn't what the other options that are being proposed that are much more harmful, potentially. We're hoping that we can work within the framework of this particular bill to push forward, like I said, removing the criminal penalties for youth and adults, and expanding infrastructure across the state for communities to be able to respond to the challenges that they are experiencing, and that those responses will be adequately and well funded, and that we can start working within a more restorative framework, not a restoration to baseline oppression, but restoration that involves healing and transformation within our communities from the harms that we have been experiencing. So I hope that answered your question, Amija.
No, you did a wonderful job. That was wonderful, giving more context to how this impacts our communities across the state. I just wanted to give Isaac an opportunity. Do you want to respond at all before I move over, or add anything to what Malika has just shared before I move on to our next panelist speaker? Okay. So I would like to invite in another level of dialogue around this. We have Bree Jefferson. Bree has been, well, my relationship and my communication or engagement with Bree started some years ago in Olympia. We're both at the state capitol doing some work, and we were on a racial equity team where we took some time to look at particular bills and policies that were going to be moving forward. And we had to ask the question, is this good for racial equity? How is it supporting Black and Brown and people of color communities? Those types of questions. And so Bree has continued to the work around strengthening her expertise in the policy arena. That's what I want to say. Ooh, got that out. So Bree, I just want to have you come in. You can introduce yourself, and if you wanted to add a little bit to this conversation around how the legislature is working and how they're trying to approach their response to the Blake decision. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amija. So my name is Bree Jefferson. My pronouns are she and her. My background is in legislative affairs and in policy work. Like Amija was saying, I've done some racial equity work. I spent over 5 years working down in Olympia in both the Senate and the House as staff for the Democratic caucuses. I now do political advocacy work as well as like independent legislative consulting, which is why I'm here in this capacity. You know, I just came on and got familiar with the Blake case and the bills that are happening pretty recently, but I will say, you know, my understanding, unfortunately, of what is happening in Olympia is a lot of trying to get things done very quickly without the full analysis of the impacts that these certain bills might have on community, particularly with the Blake case and the mullet bill, as well as the other bills, and the one that was brought up by Senator Dingra. You know, we're in the last couple of weeks of the legislative session. The legislators are really, really pushing that they want to end on time, that they don't want to go into special session. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of concessions that are being made, as well as things that are being dropped or coming back to life. So it's a little confusing right now with where things are at with these bills. My understanding is that there is, excuse me, movement on the Dingra bill, and that has support as it's moved through the Senate and now going through the House. You know, the bill is going to have to go through reconciliation, which means that any changes that are made are going to have to happen in both chambers. So there might be some ping-ponging back and forth over the next couple of weeks. But this really is kind of like the fast and furious of times where, since we are in the final stretches of the legislature, that they are going to just try to ram things out and get things done on time, which is a little unfortunate.
Thank you, Bree. And that, again, is why we are using this platform, King County Equity Now, all the other partners here converge to help us share this information with community as soon as we can. I mean, the Blake decision came out, the Washington State v. Blake decision came out at the end of February. People started getting a couple of news articles and some conversation was happening early March, but in terms of how the state legislature and our local municipalities were responding to this, there wasn't much community dialogue happening. And so as a person who tries to be abreast and be as engaged with our state legislature as possible, I learned about this last week. Fortunately, because a couple of our House representative and one of our state legislators reached out to community to say, this is what's going on, to allow us to have some dialogue. But even that dialogue was distilled to a few folks who happened to be connected with the legislature. So it's like, well, let's bring this out to community. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be us on the local level, talking to our municipalities about how we want to see our elected officials and decision makers moving in step for the people at the same time on the state level. And so with the state having the power to make a decision that will set the standard for the whole state, there's a definitely pressure being placed on the state to make some decisions, but it doesn't excuse the state or any legislator to push forward legislation that's still harmful to our communities, that's going to continue harm and take us backwards. And I just want to give people a really quick brief, because we are talking about the state legislature. And for those who are not familiar with the process up there, our state capital in Washington State is in Olympia. And there is a House, and there is a Senate, and there's a governor's department. So bills and ideas and policies get moved through those houses. They either come through the House of Representatives or they come through the Senate. They are negotiated in committees on both of those chambers. And when they are executed or voted out of those particular committees or chambers, which could be a policy committee or a budget committee, then those bills that are exited out or voted out of are then exchanged to the other committee. And that same process happens again. And the way that they are moved out, they are voted on the floor. But if they're voted off of the floor after they've been exchanged and they've been agreed upon, then they go to the governor's table, where the governor either signs them in or strikes some pieces out or vetoes the bill altogether. So I just want to give people a sense of what that process is like. And when we're saying a House, we're talking about the House of Representatives, because in each of our legislative districts, we have one senator and 2 representatives. So that means we have a total of 98. We have 49 districts in the state with 3 legislators in each district. So on that local level, they should be representing us from these different parts of the state. But ultimately, it goes to the governor to be signed off, vetoed, or something is stricken out. So I just want to give you all a heads up of what we're talking about when we say a senator. If you're in the 37th district, Seattle, South Seattle, and parts of the central area, Senator Rebecca Saldana is our senator. Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos is one of our representatives. And then Representative Kirsten Harris Talley is our other representative, just as an example of when I say representatives. So I would love to bring into this dialogue and this conversation, people who have lived experience, and to me, those are experts. I would love to bring into this conversation Miss Donita Madden. Go ahead with your bad self.
Thank you, Maija. So a lot of the work that I think I do in organizations have to do with human resources and strategic planning around examining anti-racist strategies in policies. And it's really the institutional racism pieces within organizations, but the lived out experience outweigh that. So I have many family members that have struggled with addiction on both sides of my paternal and maternal side. And the more present issue that I deal with today has to do with my son, who's almost 30. I am really disturbed by, I think, the last conversation on Friday, where we were listening to some of our elected officials talking about really in deficit and limitation about what they feel was possible and what they could get a partnership around, and letting that drive the decision. I heard a lot of conversation, I think last week, around the criminal legal system, and it's just making me think more about the legal criminalization and justification system, because oftentimes you have these acts that are happening disproportionately to our family members, and feeling like powerless in it. Like you're kind of, it's like an out of body experience, I think. And so because I know, if I was looking at the Big Lake decision over here and some other references to other cases, the Representative Saldana, as she was speaking about relying on prosecutors not having time to prosecute the cases. They waited 5 years to hit my son with a felony possession for paraphernalia. He didn't have any substance on him, and then told them that he was struggling in treatment. And the judge basically told him that, hey, I wouldn't have a job if people like you didn't show up in court. So I think that is the wrong approach, to say that you have to give a win to prosecutors or kind of the other side at the expense of waiting for people to not have time to prosecute, because they will find the time, has been my experience when it comes to this issue, and just disregard, the fact that when it was crack, it was more individualized in the war on drugs in our community. But now that it's an opiate crisis and Sally and Tim and so forth are wrapped up in it, then we want to take action. But we also want to maintain kind of this divide around race within the system. And I'm not comfortable with relying on someone else's subjectivity of elected officials. Either you're going to do something or you're not going to do something. But I think there's no straddling the fence on it. Here's a platform to really do something impactful and take a stand. The last 30 years, organizations have spent upward billions of dollars in DEI training and anti-racist training. And this is where you put it into practice. If it was easy, any of us could do it. But it's how we make decisions, and it's the decisions that we make. So I am just really, I was triggered. I think Imijah used the word for me Friday. I was triggered by that and tried to clear some of my schedule to engage in this conversation. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, the stories of our lived experience and the realities of, people can write things in policy all day long, and it's supposed to work like this. We're going to give a resource here and we're going to refer you out here. But what does that look like in reality? And it's particularly for our Black and Brown and Indigenous folks. What does that really look like? And thank you, Ms. Donita, for sharing that. Although it looks good on paper and the way it's supposed to work, you have just proven and shown to us it doesn't work like that. And then who is left to support? Who does that fall on? It falls back on the families, and it falls back on the communities to find a circle of support to bring wholeness to the harm of not just the substance that was used, but also to the system of how they're treating our community and family members as they're trying to navigate back to wholeness. So thank you for what you do for your family, and thank you for educating us here today. I wanted to bring in a conversation, bring in Ms. Cassandra Butler to share with us her perspective around this Blake decision in this bill. Cassandra and I are part of the Community Queens Collective. Cassandra has an anti-racist organizer in the community and has just another community queen that just takes care of all of us. But Cassandra, you could share more about your background. Thank you.
Thank you, Imijah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cassandra Butler. I use she, her pronouns, and I work in many different capacities, do anti-racist organizing and abolition work around Department of Correction policies. But for the last 15 years, I have been working with young people, youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And so that's kind of the angle I'm going to be talking about today, and the concerns that I have and that other folks have about Senate Bill 5476. And those concerns are specifically around the gross misdemeanor that is attached to youth and young adults, to folks under the age of 21, for possession of drugs and or possession of paraphernalia. Specifically the paraphernalia piece, because in King County, which is where I work, we are funded. There are many organizations that are funded to do harm reduction, handing out clean needles, handing out different harm reduction supplies in order to keep our young people safe that are currently in addiction. And while we try to meet them where they're at, try to guide them through their addiction, knowing that threatening jail, threatening citations, threatening all of these things do not deter young people from using drugs. So we have to take a different avenue. So the concern here is making it a gross misdemeanor creates a straight line to prison for many youth and young adults that are using drugs and are now going to be criminalized at an even higher rate for just paraphernalia being on their persons. And paraphernalia can include many other things other than needles. Paraphernalia is discretionary. I mean, it's discretionary in the organizations that we work in, but in many spots in this bill, a lot of things are discretionary. So depending on who's picking you up, who's showing up, who's arresting you or not arresting you, paraphernalia looks like pieces of foil, it looks like clean needles, it looks like rubber bands. I mean, there's not a definition about paraphernalia. So that really caused me and others to pause around this bill. The other piece that is a little scary in connection with that as well is, as many of you might know, the Blake decision that opened the door for a lot of folks to be able to come home, but also have some of the wrongs righted as far as LFOs and stuff, carries a pretty significant financial tab for many cities and counties. And so within this bill, Senate Bill 5476 is a monetary incentive for folks, because money is collected from citations in this bill go back into the Blake pot. So it refunds cities and counties for money that's being spent on the Blake decision. And that's also concerning because that incentivizes discretionary pieces of whether we're going to treatment, whether we're going to arrest folks. And that's really problematic to leave that kind of discretion to law enforcement, especially when you're talking about Black and Brown youth, Black and Brown communities that have historically been the targets of law enforcement. So it is a big concern to have that discretionary piece in there. And I just wanted to spend a little time today to kind of shed some light on that because I work with these young people. I work with young people all over the place that are not going to be incentivized to head to treatment by more punitive actions. So I think we need to bring the conversation. It's not great that we're fast tracking bills through just to get something on the books, and then we're just going to redo the harms that have started to become undone. So I think a community conversation and continued attention to this is necessary before we're just pushing stuff through. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise, and your lens around this. This is really fruitful for all who are watching and listening and who plan to share more in their community. Thank you so much. I just want to highlight quickly, there was an acronym used, LFO. That's legal financial obligation. So in our legal system, Cassandra did highlight there's people can get a citation, which are a fine. In our legal system, just being arrested, being booked, different things, being sentenced, there's fines associated with that. And oftentimes, and most times, even when you're sentenced, there's additional fines that are attached. And so there's been a lot of organizing that's been happening to try to reduce, that has reduced the interest rate on those fines, because those fines have been a barrier to folks once they're in the system prior to like getting off of probation or having your rights returned, or some people being called back to prison and to jails because they hadn't paid those fines. So it was like an extension. When I think of it, it's an extension of servitude or enslavement. Like you can't quite get yourself free till you pay these fines. So, and these fines do, like Cassandra said, pay to keep these systems in place. So when there's something that's going to take these fines away or take money away, people fight for that. So as Malika had shared, how the system recreates itself. So for all of us out here really fighting to eliminate, structural racism, and if you've ever heard the term, like as soon as you knock some part down, it will recreate itself. This is the example of how it recreates itself. The example is how the policy would be re-entered, or the fines will be introduced to keep the system going. So now folks who might say that they really care about the humanity of folks and don't want to see people put in jail but they're going to advocate for their jobs because they need the money and they don't want to lose it. That's how the system kind of recreates itself. And what are people willing to lose? Are you willing to do a different job or lose a wage to keep, sending people to prison just so your family can eat? And that's a real reality that we don't oftentimes look at on that level. That's sometimes what it comes down to. So I want to transition and take this conversation to Mr. Delbert Richardson, an elder in our community, honorable Mr. Delbert Richardson. My connection with Mr. Richardson really is his education advocacy work, what he brings to our community that our systems and our schools do not have currently, history and curriculum about American history. So I came into my connection with him. He's offering a free tour of his museum at Tabernacle Church some years back. I brought my sons, and it was that day forward. I said, whatever I got to do to get this into the schools, myself being an education advocate, I wanted to do. So that's been my history, Mr. Delbert's work, and you can share more about what you do. But he also, like we all are, have multiple talents and trades and lean in where we can to support our community, and is here to talk to us about the treatment, and particularly centering around the African American and the Black experience. Welcome.
Thank you, Maja. Hello, Sister Madden, Treyana. I see some familiar faces, and thank you so much for the invite. And Sister Cassandra, thank you so much for what you shared. Yeah, my name is Delbert Richardson, and I do not take that word elder lightly, because I operate also to that. Eldership does not denote an age. It denotes a certain amount of wisdom. And it's something that you have to be vetted, in my language, before you can be called an elder. So I want to say that with honor and reverence. I accept that, but it also comes with a level of responsibility. That's the flip side too, because when you become an elder, not only are you giving wisdom, but people are watching. And I love that fact, because one of my primary responsibilities to me is to model that which I'm hoping to see and manifest. So I might to talk a little bit about what I do. I'm a self-taught educator. I teach American history through an Afrocentric lens. I have a national award-winning traveling museum. And briefly to talk about that work is I use a multidisciplinary pedagogy or teaching style that incorporates storytelling, the ancient art of storytelling. I use authentic artifacts and storyboards. And so if you think about history, it's primarily taught through the lens of the victor. And so I teach my story, I teach our story, but I also teach about his story. And so history for me is taught from the bottom up. And so what you're going to do is you're going to hear about those stories that represent resilience, perseverance, courage, determination, all those things that's not necessarily told about our story from the dominant culture. So thank you so much. And I was listening, and I have a lived experience. And Danietta, I feel you, because I have one of my sons also too is struggling right now, and I pray. But I'm also in recovery from substance abuse, and so my own lived experience allows me to have an intentional lens around this thing that we're talking about in terms of addiction. Let me just share this too. Let me point out one section that I spent a lot of time in. That's the enslavement section. And so I often talk about them, and these are like Delbertisms, right? So I'm self-taught. What I've learned also too, it's almost impossible to heal if you don't know the nature and the impact of the injury. Now, I don't have a PhD. I got a BA though, and I love that. But I'm speaking through a historical lens based on research, and that injury is the enslavement period. I think it's something that's not talked about enough, because there's a certain amount of healing needs to happen on those of diaspora, but also from white folks as well. That's not talked about. And I'm not going to go into that too much, but there's this book by Resma, Grandmother's Hands, that I'm just going to throw out there for any white folks in the audience, because he talks about trauma that white folks endured in Europe at the hands of their own people that look like them, and then coming to North America, carrying that trauma in their cells and now inflicted on other people. I'm going to leave it right there, and I'm going to speak to the African American or the BIPOC experience. You know, I'll say recovery, because to me there's a difference between recovery and sobriety. Sobriety means to abstain. Recovery means that I'm constantly working every day to be the healthy person that I know for a fact I want to be. And what does that look like? I'm in therapy, I do support groups, and I also talk at events like this, because addiction is a shame-based disease, but it's also a family disease. So to put this in perspective as it relates to laws, you know, when the sister was talking about, I forget the language she used about misdemeanors or something, but it brought me back to the 13th Amendment. So we're talking about laws. And the 13th Amendment, for those that don't know, can look it up. It was really that amendment that was written to abolish slavery, right? But you got to read it, because the same thing that Sister Cassandra talked about, they wrote into the 13th Amendment. They wrote in some wiggle room. It says, you're free, I'm paraphrasing, you're free unless there's some criminalized behavior, right? And that's very subjective. That leaves a lot of room for someone to impose their power and will on another person based on their beliefs and values. And so, no different than the 13th Amendment, where our ancestors, right after the Civil War, were picked up for vagrancy, were picked up for loitering, were arrested for eyeballing. And just so you know, eyeballing meant that my male, primarily ancestors, couldn't look a white man in his face, or guess what? He was arrested. So those are the kind of things when you think about criminal behavior. And plus, there's a whole bunch of black codes that you can look up as well that were systemically introduced for the primary purpose of oppressing people, even though they were quote unquote free on paper. So I believe is that racism, white supremacy has an intentionality to continue to oppress BIPOC people on a regular basis. And Sister Donetta put it into the chat, it's all about capitalism. There's big money in institutions. Jails have been privatized and so forth and so on. And if you've ever had the experience of having to put some money on somebody's books for a phone call, you'll get a real quick dose when you find out how much it costs for 1 minute on a phone call, right? Which makes no sense at all unless you're operating through a capitalism mentality. So I just want to share those little tidbits. But, you know, to speak about the Blake decision, and I had heard about it on the news, but I didn't know there was a name associated. And Elijah, thank you for calling me, because I just want to speak to what I believe is so important in regards to healing. You know, if you know anything about science, there's a term called epigenetics, right? And you can look it up. And basically what it is, you know, the dominant culture or white people, and I'm using a broad term, science says it does not exist unless it can be counted and measured. Well, lo and behold, they come up with a system to count and measure trauma. And what does that look like? Basically, they're saying now, and they embrace this, is that trauma can be passed down through the genes of the DNA. So if that is true, and I believe that to be true, then I am carrying 400 years of trauma in my cells. Now, that's great information, but there's not a support around that in terms of education, in terms of support, in terms of counseling or therapy, then that just continues to sit. So what I've learned, in order for me to stay in recovery, I need to have some wraparound services. I need to have housing. I need to have food. I need to have support systems. I need to have people that look like me to have a lived experience. And so when we start talking about the criminalization system, I always ask the question when it comes down to treatment, and I've been to treatment twice. If we fully believe that race as a social construct is developed where whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom, it's a social construct, then if you have institutions that are developed and ran by white people, but black and brown people are a part of that system, don't you believe that oppression is going to happen in those systems as well? That's just simple math. So the question becomes, when can we get the resources that we need to help treat our own people? Because we're in a better position to do that from a cultural standpoint and a spiritual standpoint than anybody. So, Elijah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a very, very, very sensitive topic for me because I have a vested interest in helping save BIPOC children, because it's all around how they feel about themselves. And if you got a system that's constantly chipping away at who you are, how you exist, and how you're viewed, at some point, you may start believing a lie, and you may give up believing that you don't have any value. So one of my primary goals, and I do that with the museum, I teach American history, but I start with Mother Africa, what's intentional, and I teach STEM, which is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math, coming out of the continent of Africa. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'll put my website in the chat too, for those that want to know more information.
Thank you so much for the wisdom. Yes, you are truly have been vetted and credited as our honorable elder in our communities. You actually have a library, you actually have a museum that you're sharing with community, but I do describe folks and elders like you as walking institutions because of all the greatness and the wisdom that you do carry with you. And so I would like to use this platform to really just say from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate you greatly. And thank you for everything that you do, not just for the Black community, but everything that you do for our whole community.
Ashe.
Ashe, yes. Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's more conversation that we can have in dialogue and trying to bring perspective into this conversation around Blake. And what I really appreciate is how on this particular platform, we are taking it from the foundation. Mr. Richardson, Mr. Delbert brought to us about that 13th Amendment, and Cassandra connected it right to currently, like what the policy says. And it's about Blake and this opportunity with Blake, but it's about what we're trying to do moving forward, because the institutions have normalized anti-Blackness. The institutions in the process has normalized the racism and white supremacy that's built into it. So whatever the outcome, and we should definitely be advocating, and you should definitely continue to advocate what you want around the response on our state level, because they are responding. We don't get to decide if they're not going to respond. And as you heard from Bree Jefferson, they're trying to end on time, April the 25th. The hearing was today. If you were not able to participate in the hearing by personal testimony or submitting something in writing, you still have 24 hours after that hearing to still submit something in writing, or at least say if you're pro, other, or con. And whatever you do, I really encourage you to write out what your concerns are so that your decision isn't misunderstood, right? They can't put assumptions around your pro stance, your con stance, or your other stance, that you make it clear to them why you feel the way you feel. But in saying that, and I'm bringing it to the Black community, but I'm asking for the solidarity and requesting the solidarity from all the other communities, that we most definitely continue this conversation, that it doesn't stop here. It doesn't stop on April 25th. And that's actually the conversation didn't start at the end of April when the Blake decision occurred. This is ongoing conversation about how we need to come to a different, America got to come to a different era. The United States got to come to a point of healing, a different era. You know how they call it the Renaissance era, and we go back in history. Well, this is an era of healing for us, and we have to stay engaged in the conversation. So we're talking about Blake, we're talking about possession and criminalizing, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor. But the conversation is about seeing the humanity in people and how we support them, so that this is not an issue, how we are not looking to demonize people and shame people as a way to profit or support some system or structure. So that's a call to action that I'm putting out there, that we continue this dialogue. We look at, oh, maybe Blake, maybe this bill is just a strategy to move a step forward for more dialogue. We don't need this bill to have more dialogue. This dialogue must continue, and we must continue the pressure on any of our elected officials and decision makers who get to put in the vote. But the community, we have the voice, and we have made change. When my father passed away on his deathbed, he said, we are our ancestors' prayers. So we've been doing the work, and we don't stop here. I don't even see the time. We got about a few more minutes, because then we're going to transition this over to Ms. Trayana Holiday to answer and respond to some questions of the panelists. But I would love to, before we do some questions, did any of our speakers want to add anything before we transition over that you didn't get a chance to say? I don't see any hands, and I don't see any speakers going up. Oh, Miss Donita.
I think I so appreciate everything, and unfortunately I have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. But is there easy access to where we should email our letters that you could share with us? Because I do want to write something, and I always think that I know, this white urgency, the quick turnaround, things like that is intentional. That's always the strategy, to rush something through so that we can't jump in and we have to adjust things at the last minute. And I'm happy to be up all night tonight putting together my thoughts so that it's ready to be submitted. I just don't know where to submit it because I haven't been involved on this side. But any support you could provide, I greatly appreciate it.
That's a wonderful question. So I encourage you all to go to leg.wa.gov. That's leg.wa.gov. That is the home page to the website of our Washington State Legislature. And you will see on that page, you might have to look a little bit. If you're looking at it, you're looking on your right side, it should say participating in the legislature. You click on that button there, and it should take you to a place where it talks about how you can testify or participate on a particular bill. You need to have the bill number. It's in the chat, 5476. You can also go to the home page and just look for bill information and put 5476 in there. And then it should give you the bill number, and then there'll be something should be on the right-hand side that also says how to testify or participating in the legislature. Anyways, once you click on there and you put the bill number in, it'll ask you the bill number and what committee it was. And it's in the Senate. And it was the Senate Ways and Means, which is a budget committee. Then you can click on there, and then you can go in and go ahead and put in a written testimony or kind of sign in of how you choose. So leg.wa.gov. Well, thank you. I would love to pass this on to Ms. Trayana Holiday. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. This has impacted almost, I want to say how this possession and criminalizing possession and the war on drugs has impacted the Black community, particularly in the historical Black Central District. It was part of the gentrification. So when we were talking about the holistic care and wraparound of how we take care of each other, we also need to have a community. We also need to have our brick and mortar. Because again, oftentimes the richness and the expertise, the healers are in our community to support us. And so I want us to continue to understand why we fight for, land acquisitions, why we fight for making sure that our presence is still in our communities, and why we fight to continue to build our communities. We need all of this in addition to the resources for healthcare, in addition to the resources for treatment, and all the resources, education that any community would need. But we have to have our community. With that said, I finally, for real, am transitioning. Go ahead, Trey.
Let's see there. Thank you so much, Imajah. Thank you to everyone for bringing your expertise to this community conference. Again, as I said in the beginning, it's so important for us at King County Equity Now to ensure that our community has a pathway of engagement, also being informed, but bringing their brilliance to bear here. As we saw and heard from so many of the panelists today, that, you know, there is a multi-pronged approach with this, and it affects and hits our families in a wide variety of ways. But it is really through our collective voice and our collective action that we will be able to let the legislators know what we're feeling here on the ground and how it's impactful for our communities. I know we have a few questions here in the chat. I want to be able to get to them. The first question I saw here was, oh, yes, you should be able to get a copy, Mr. Aaron Allen from the Medium. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Katoya, for responding in the chat. Somebody is wondering if this is all speculation or innuendo. And it's clear that from listening, that was kind of early on, so maybe this has been answered from, I know this came from Converge's Facebook stream, but really there's a lot of documentation that goes to show, I mean, we have so much data that actually showcases how particularly Black community has experienced levels of how possession charges can then result on more charges, stacking up charges, creating devastation in Black communities. So there's a lot of data to show that, and I hope some of the panelists were able to answer that for you. The next question I see here is, we are already seeing ordinances to recriminalize drug possession after February's Blake decision in Marysville, March 8th, and Lewis County, March 16th. How do these moves to recriminalize inform our strategy? And I want to be able to go to any of you, but I was thinking about Bree, if you may have an answer, or Malika, if you would like to respond.
Bree can go first if they would like, and then I can follow up.
Sure. I mean, you know, unfortunately, this is something that we see. I saw some folks talking about this in the chat, is that we probably will start seeing counties across the state, particularly like more conservative leading counties, start doing these local ordinances. I think with that, it really is a strategy, you know, shifting after the legislative session to really focusing on the local governments as well. They are just as beholden to responding to the public the same way that the legislature is supposed to be. And oftentimes they're able to get away with doing these kind of things because there is a lack of public pressure. And so I would say the strategy is shifting to these local ordinances after legislative session, while still keeping up the conversation with the legislature and letting them know that we're watching them at the same time, and really just kind of putting the message out there that we understand what is happening. We understand the legalities of this, and we are going to confront you about what is happening in a strategic way that I think can make an impact.
So we are already seeing jurisdictions that are, so Lewis County, the only reason that they did not already pass an ordinance recriminalizing simple possession was because of some organizing that I helped a local group in that community do, because I do believe it's all about, you know, getting local people organized. And they were able to slow down the process to at least make it so that their county commissioners and the city that were looking to implement new code stopped until at least after the legislative session. Marysville has already moved forward with this. Washington State, just like if we talk about from a dynamics perspective, is a local control state. And so once we have an establishment of a number of local laws that are not in alignment with each other across our state, it's going to be a lot harder to roll that back. That is the place, and I totally, to the point that was made earlier, I believe by Donita, that, responding to the white supremacist tactic of, go now, go now, go now, and like moving on somebody else's schedule, that's a real thing. And also, as we've learned, that is something that happens. And that's part of the urgency behind the Blake decision, because even though they acknowledged a lot of things that the Black community has known for a long time about the oppressive nature of the war on drugs and the way that it has played out in our communities, it did not guarantee that simple possession was going to remain decriminalized. And, we have this very imperfect, I want to make sure everybody hears me say imperfect piece of legislation that is in front of us right now. Strategically, it is something that has to be addressed with this particular piece, because in order to implement the budget. So that means that they're looking to apply funding that would be able to go across the whole entire state to be able to build infrastructure, not just within existing frameworks, but build out new frameworks. And that's why it's great that we're having this conversation and that we're able to start to, put all these things that we've been thinking about for a long time to address social determinants of health and the places that we need to invest, and that community is organizing around this, so that, engaging with your legislators, you can be like, when it comes to the implementation piece, this is where the investments need to happen. But if we wait, it's not completely a false paradigm of, like, they're just going to push our hand on it and we should talk about this. We should talk about it. You're right. We should be able to take a more planful approach. That was what Pathways to Recovery did, is that we had a 2-year time frame so that we could have the real meaningful conversations. Nobody saw Blake coming. Blake came. And now what are we going to do so that we don't lose traction? Because if we end up with a patchwork of logs, it is not going to be a pretty situation. I was not joking about the Green Book reference that I made earlier, which were the books that, were used in, Delbert can speak to this. Anyway, the books that were used during Jim Crow times, that some of us would say have not really ever ended. But anyway, but Jim Crow times that made it let you know where the safe places were for Black people to, sleep, stop in your car. These are real concerns. And there's people all across the state trying to fight this stuff. But Federal Way just moved to the mayor of Federal Way just suspended all syringe exchange operations in the city of Federal Way, in spite of the fact that there are some of the highest overdose rates that are occurring in Seattle King County in Federal Way, in spite of having disproportionately high HIV rates as well, and transmission rates. But because, and I say this as a person who ran a syringe exchange for 13 years, that, and I'm not just talking about, I sat in an office, like I did the direct service in the back roads of Thurston County, and I served 6 different counties. So, and I saw people from all over the state that, it doesn't, when you see needle trash and like used syringes, it's because you need more service, not because you need less. And so this move to do that signals to me that these are going to be some of the jurisdictions that are going to try and come up with their own local code in order to recriminalize simple possession. And these also tend to be the areas where people of color have been pushed out of the central district into, and also have always had their own, Black populations as well. But these are like the real, and I would say urgent concerns that we need to be mindful of, not so that we are reactionary, but so that we are responsive and thoughtful, even though the conversations have happened in a very chaotic and sporadic manner. But it's like, we have to be responsive, in my opinion. I can't stress that enough. And I'm not saying that 5476 is the be all end all. There's a whole lot I don't like about it, but it means that we have to be at the table And we have to be a meaningful part of the conversation in order to get the things that our communities need. And that's still possible. And in my opinion, we kind of got to do it in this session. We got to start it, should I say.
Wow.
I just want to,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to just speaking just a little bit off of what Malika just said. I think it's important to note as well that a lot of these local municipalities rely on LFOs as a way to fund a lot of what's happening in their cities as well. So they have a vested interest in trying to make sure that people are caught up in the criminal justice system. I just think that that's an interesting element that isn't often brought up, but is a really important aspect of the work that needs to be done.
Because exactly, that is another example of the system reorienting itself to protect itself. And this, literally in Lewis County, part of the reason they were so upset about the Blake decision was because they said, how are we going to pay for our drug court then? And I was like, that shouldn't actually be your consideration. It should be, like, how do we build out relevant systems of care that are actually going to help support people and repair communities? And even though there's definitely not a huge Black population down there, there's a large people of color population down there. So, I mean, a growing, should I say, because people are migrating south because it is too expensive to live, further up north. So these are all things to think about. And it might be a local code, but it's still going to impact people, and civil infractions turn into criminal obligations oftentimes for people that have been marginalized across the board.
Wow, thank you so much, Bree and Malika. Clearly, you guys and your expertise and personal experience with this is so helpful and needed in guiding this discussion so people can understand much of the nuance that oftentimes is not experienced until you're in the thick of it, or really that is what your profession is and you are able to understand it from a wide variety of perspectives. I appreciate everybody in the chat and thank you. And, I'll tell you this much, that there's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen in South King County as well in terms of educating the community, because you're absolutely right, Malika. There's many families. My family was one that was displaced from the Central District of Seattle and had to move and buy a home in Federal Way. And we knew nothing about Federal Way. So thank you, Trinice, my good friend Trinice out there in Federal Way, holding it down. In terms of Black advocacy and Black organizing. You do a lot of great work out there. And I think that more and more of us that are living in Federal Way and that have families out there really need to find more ways to educate community in terms of how the city council moves certain things forward without the voice of community. I think it's important. And one of the things that Seattle does well that other cities, particularly South King County, can learn from is to find ways to embrace community members and their concerns. This is just one of the ways that King County Equity Now is looking to, again, educate and inform our community and staying on top of these things, because we understand that oftentimes if it is not a collective voice that is at the table, there is going to be a lot of measures that go to legislation that get passed in Olympia that do not have the voice of the people at heart. And so I'm really thankful to all of you who joined today. I know all of you panelists are also grateful. Us at King County Equity Now are really thankful because it does really take large voices of collectivity to really move a lot of things forward. And thank you, Elder Richardson, Mr. Delbert, for bringing your expertise to bear here. So glad that you were able to join us today. Thank you again to all the panelists, Cassandra, Bree, Malika, Danieta, Isaac. You guys have all been doing a great job. And thank you, Imijah, for your foresight to know we had to make sure we got something pulled together quickly for our community so that we can make sure people are engaged and informed. We look forward to bringing you more of these community conferences so that we can continue conversations with regard to various topics that are always going to impact us and our families. And with that, we want to thank you again, and we hope that you have a really great rest of your Monday. Thanks for joining us today, you guys.